Welcome, historians, as we get ready for World War II Part 9, the Nueve, as we turn our attention from the European theater of war over to the Pacific theater of war. So, again, a little recap here. The attack on Pearl Harbor occurs on December 7th, 1941. Now the U.S. needs to mobilize because now we're at war with not just the Japanese, we're also at war with the other Axis powers, the Italians and the Germans in Europe. With our allies, we decide that for the Allied effort, we're going to focus on war on Europe first, but for the United States, we've got to do both. We've got to fight in Europe with, British, Soviet, Canadian help, but then in the Pacific, things were different. The U.S. was on its own. We were responsible for challenging the Japanese after Pearl Harbor, and the Japanese had taken control over most of East and Southeast Asia, Korea, Eastern China, the Philippines, Burma, what is today Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos, Indonesia, the Pacific Islands west of Midway. Everything really is under Japanese control in 1942. And we've got to start to turn back some of the tide. We also, again, we need to mobilize very quickly. We need to, start to increase the size of our Navy. We need more planes, because when you're going to fight in the Pacific theater, when we look at Japan's empire, they're doing it on the back of their Navy and their Air Force. Now, of course, you need an army to be able to, hold Iwo Jima, to be able to hold Guam, to be able to hold the Marshall Islands. You need an army there after you roll in. But to get there and to do a lot of the fighting, you're going to use your Navy and your Air Force. Now, one of the big things out in the Pacific theater is going to be the importance of an aircraft carrier. All right, aircraft carriers they're enormous ships. I mean, they're honestly hard to describe how large they are back then and today. They're floating cities. They're large enough that a plane can take off and land on them. All right, so you need a lot of space to do that. Just, think about watching a plane take off or land, just on land, right? I mean, it's crazy. So aircraft carriers are going to be key. That's what's going to help you move around to be able to take your Air Force to areas where it couldn't get otherwise. And then once you take over the islands, you can start to build airstrips, right? Once you take over the island, you can build an airstrip where planes can take off and land on a little mini airport, if you will. It's actually what my grandpa Ralph was responsible for doing in the Pacific. He was an engineer, and him and his unit of the Navy Seabees, the naval engineers, built airstrips in the Pacific. And he did that until one of them that he was working on was bombed, and he was badly injured, and then eventually shipped back to the United States. But you need aircraft carriers, you need a Navy, you need an Air Force, and you need to go through and try to roll back this giant empire that the Japanese have built in the Pacific. So we start to mobilize, and in 1942, we're going to see a couple important battles in the Pacific. Again, it's all about these naval battles. So in the spring of 1942, we see two big battles. The first, before we get to Midway, there was the Battle of Coral Sea. The Battle of Coral Sea, May 7th to 8th. The Japanese are trying to invade Australia at this time, and the United States was able to stop an invasion of Australia. This is one of the first times that the Japanese have been repelled, so it was an important moral victory. And it also took resources away from the Japanese. They were constantly on the hunt for oil. They needed to take over as many oil refineries as they could to be able to, give fuel for all of their planes and all of their ships. But the big turning point is the Battle of Midway, June 4 to June 7 of 1942. So again, June 4th through 7th, 1942, the Battle of Midway. This is the big turning point in the Pacific theater. So it's happening early on in the war, but it doesn't mean that we're going to quickly or easily win after this. It's just a big moment. So what happened here, the U.S. was always, and this is always happening in war, you're always intercepting your enemy's messages and trying to decode them. The U.S. was able to intercept and decode a Japanese message before the Battle of Midway that basically allowed us to know where the battle was going to take place and how it was going to be fought. So we knew the Japanese were going to launch some type of large-scale attack to try to take out some of our aircraft carriers. We just didn't know where. Well, we find this message, we intercept it, we decode it, and the Japanese message says, on June 4th, we're going to go to Midway Island, and we're going to try to destroy two U.S. aircraft carriers. Well, now we know their game plan. We know where they're going to be. We know how they're going to fight. There was more stuff in the message, and it allowed the U.S. to be prepared. And we ended up having a huge victory. We sunk 4 Japanese aircraft carriers and destroyed 300 of their planes. So they still had a couple aircraft carriers left and hundreds of planes, but This was the majority of their forces. So after this, the Japanese were not going to be able to launch a lot of aggressive offensive campaigns. Instead, they were going to have to be on the defensive because now we had the advantage of more aircraft carriers and more planes. So we were mobile, nimble, we could be aggressive. They had to be defensive because these aircraft carriers are really difficult to build. It's not like a destroyer or a cruiser or a submarine when you can build one in, 3, 4, 5 weeks, 2 months. Aircraft carriers take, 6, 7, 8, 9 months to build, and you need enormous amounts of metals to be able to do it, which the Japanese just didn't have at this time. And the US continued to crank stuff out. So we increased our advantage that we had. Whereas the Japanese weren't able to address their weakness because they didn't have the supplies to do so. So after Coral Sea and Midway, we went on this campaign called island hopping. All right, this was the U.S. strategy that the Pacific naval commanders adopted, island hopping. What we would do here is we would go through the Pacific, and if there was a small island that we didn't think was very important, we would bypass it. If there was a large island that we thought was important, we would attack it. So you bypass and isolate certain islands, and then you attack other islands. So anything that was very important, you attack. Anything that was easily defeatable, you attack. Anything that you can just kind of like isolate and kind of starve out by cutting it off from the rest of the Japanese Empire, that's what you do. So you saw an admiral named Chester Nimitz in charge who was doing the work with the Navy, and then you had General Douglas MacArthur who was controlling the Marine forces. So you had the Navy and the Marines working in the Pacific, and then you had the Army and the Air Force working in the European theater of war. So we went through this policy of island hopping. We skip some, we attack others, and it's a case-by-case basis. It was very successful. It worked very well, and it was good that we didn't try to attack every island because honestly it wasn't necessary. Now, there's a couple very important battles here that we'll highlight. One is the Battle of Leyte Gulf in October of 1944. So Leyte Gulf in 1944 was when we basically destroyed the Japanese Navy. After this, the Japanese didn't have... Excuse me, just had a little sneeze attack there. The Japanese didn't have any aircraft carriers left. Most of their ships were destroyed, so they can't really engage in too many more offensive campaigns anymore after the Battle of Leyte Gulf. Well, they couldn't they couldn't engage in any offensive campaigns after Midway. Now their ability to be, even defensive is hurt because basically all of their navy is destroyed. It was also at the Battle of Leyte Gulf. This was the first time that we saw the Japanese using kamikaze pilots, where they would take these suicide pilots. They would take their planes, fill them with explosives, and then try to crash them into the side of American ships to sink them. It was actually very ineffective. It was actually a terrible waste of resources, but it's an example to show how desperate the Japanese were getting because they understood that they were running out of materials and they were running out of time, so they were willing to do anything they could to try to gain some type of victory. The Battle of Okinawa, April to June of 1945, was one of the most intense battles that the world has ever seen. It was very difficult to fight in these circumstances. We'll talk about that in a little bit. But this really secured that the Philippines would be taken over and won. At first we took over the Philippines, then we went on to Okinawa. Now we have the path to get to Japan. Sorry, a little slip up there. So first we took the Philippines before this, then we take Okinawa. There you can see it right off the southern coast of Japan. Now we have the ability to attack mainland Japan. Now we're close enough. All right, Iwo Jima was another crazy, intense battle as well, but we've taken over the Philippines, we've taken over Okinawa, we've taken over Iwo Jima. Now it's easy to have bomber raids that can reach mainland Japan. We've just got to figure out how that attack is going to work. Now, one thing that we do need to know, I just mentioned it, the fighting in the Pacific was some of the most intense, grueling, difficult fighting that the world had ever seen. In Europe in World War II, it was a lot of fighting in cities, which was also very difficult. I mean, think about trying to move through downtown Milwaukee as an armed force, right? As a military regiment. There's a sniper in every window. There's a booby trap with a bomb or a mine around every corner. There's a sneak attack always, lurking. Imagine trying to even, uproot a military force that has been entrenched into a city, right? It'd be very, very difficult to do. So the European theater wasn't easy, don't get me wrong. It was a lot of very difficult fighting in the buildings and cities that made up, the European theater. In the Pacific, you're in these tropical islands. It's very humid, it's very hot, it's rainy, it's muddy. It's an environment that people aren't ready for, but you're in this jungle and you're going on these islands where the Japanese have been building defensive structures for years. I mean, there's a well-known story from the Battle of Iwo Jima. There's this group of Marines. The Marines are like the most badass fighting force that the armed forces knows at this time. It's like modern Navy SEALs. The Marines are hardcore. They go by land and sea. They're some of the most well-trained soldiers that we have in our armed forces, even still today. At the Battle of Iwo Jima, there's this regiment of Marines. There's 1,000 Marines, and they're trying to take this one hill in Iwo Jima. And for like a week, they're fighting and they're fighting and they're fighting. They're trying to take this hill. They have to take this hill to be able to take over the rest of the island and keep moving forward. And they just can't uproot this like one little hill. Finally, after like a week and a half of fighting, and hundreds of Marines dying and being wounded, they finally make it up to the top of this hill in the Battle of Iwo Jima, and it's 2 Japanese soldiers, 2 guys. They have like a bunch of different machine guns at the top of this hill in different areas. They have tunnel systems dug. They're surviving on like 4 spoonfuls of rice a day. They don't even have uniforms. They're like in their underwear and boots, and that's it. 2 guys, 5 machine guns, a spoonful of rice a day on the top of a hill on Iwo Jima held off 1,000 Marines for 10 days. Right? I mean, that's the kind of battle we're talking about. Also, in the Japanese lexicon of vocabulary, there's literally no word for surrender. Like there literally is not a word for surrender in Japanese vocabulary until after World War II. It's just not part of their culture. The soldiers in the Pacific talked about sometimes they'd be fighting and they hated it because you could never take Japanese prisoners. It was very difficult. The guys would run out of ammo and they would charge towards a line of Marines, just trying to stab them because they had to die in battle. There was no word for surrender. The fighting was brutal. It was rough. So now the United States has cleared the way for mainland Japan. We've taken back all of these islands, or we've isolated them so that way they're not important anymore. We've taken over Guadalcanal, we've taken over New Guinea, the Dutch East Indies, we've taken over the Philippines, Okinawa, Iwo Jima. Now it's time to make an attack on mainland Japan. But we don't know what that attack is going to look like. Obviously we know, spoiler alert, we're going to drop the atomic bombs and there's never going to be a true attack on mainland Japan, right? But as we're getting ready and we're looking at this, we need to know these things. There's no word for surrender. The Japanese soldiers are some of the most intense, well-trained soldiers that the world has ever seen, and we're going through some of the most intense fighting that the world has ever seen, and now we're getting ready to actually make it to mainland Japan. And the U.S. military leaders and the soldiers are terrified. Because what is this war actually going to look like? We know how hard they fought to keep Okinawa and Iwo Jima and Guam and the Philippines and Guadalcanal. How hard are they going to fight to keep mainland Japan? Are they going to be willing to literally sacrifice every man, woman, and child? Because those are in some of the estimates, right? How are you going to uproot this enemy that still has enough food, enough people, and enough supplies to put up some serious resistance once you get back to their home turf? Now, we of course have the secret weapon. Right, we're going to drop the atomic bombs, 2 atomic bombs on Japan. That's going to force their surrender. But that wasn't an easy decision to come to, and there's even a lot of debate over how to do that. And that's where we're going to hop into in the next video. Hop over to World War II Part 10. That'll be the last one for today as we look at the dropping of the atomic bombs, and then we'll come back next week and wrap up the end of the war. So go over to World War II Part 10. Good job. Keep it up.